Today, we're going to talk about a company that was, well, part business, part empire, and so powerful it literally changed the course of history. We're diving into the birth of the global economy and the story of a corporation that had the power of an entire nation. So let me just ask you this. What if a private company, like a regular business, had its own army, its own navy? What if it could invade countries and execute prisoners? Sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, right? Well, it wasn't. It was very, very real. Let's see how this all happened. All right, so to really get this, our story doesn't start with a company. It starts with a city. You see, to understand how this mega corporation was even possible, we first have to look at this huge power shift in Europe that created the perfect storm for its creation. Okay, so picture this. It's the late 1500s, and Antwerp is the place to be. It's Europe's biggest trading hub. But then, boom, in 1585, the Spanish army rolls in and shuts its port down. This causes a massive exodus. We're talking about an entire ecosystem of merchants, money, and expertise. They all flee north to Amsterdam. And almost overnight, Amsterdam goes from being this quiet little port to the new commercial capital of the entire continent. Now, before they got into the whole exotic spice trade, Amsterdam's first huge fortune was built on something, well, a lot more basic. It was called the Baltic trade. Basically, Dutch ships would sail out to places like Poland, trade stuff like wine and salt, and come back with just massive amounts of grain and wood. This was the engine that got everything started. And this is where things get really clever. This wasn't just simple trading, it was a masterful strategy. The merchants in Amsterdam basically perfected a new kind of capitalism. They'd go buy up tons of grain when it was dirt cheap, bring it back and store it in these gigantic warehouses. And then they'd just wait. They'd wait for a famine or a bad harvest to hit somewhere else in Europe, and then they'd sell all that stored grain to a desperate market for an insane profit. So, with all this money and all this experience, the Dutch merchants set their sights on an even bigger prize, the spice trade in the East Indies. But this new ambition created a huge problem, and it was a problem that needed a really radical solution. At first, you had dozens of small, separate Dutch companies all trying to get a piece of the action in Asia. And they were competing like crazy with each other. This drove prices down, it cut into profits. It was a mess for everyone. The Dutch government saw this and thought, this is totally inefficient. So they came up with a solution. Force all these competing companies to merge into one single giant corporation. And this right here is the absolute game changer. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC for short, was born, and the government gave it a complete monopoly. It wasn't just a big company, it was the only Dutch company that was allowed to trade in Asia. Just like that, all its Dutch competition was eliminated, giving the VOC unbelievable power. So how do you pay for all these ships and forts and long voyages? The VOC did something totally revolutionary. It sold shares to the public. Anybody's could buy a piece of the company. This spread out the financial risk and let them raise huge amounts of money. In the process, they basically created the world's first modern stock exchange, pioneering the kind of commercial capitalism we all live with today. And who ran this whole global enterprise? Get this, just 17 men. They were known as the Lord 17. From a room in Amsterdam, this tiny group of directors managed a commercial empire that stretched across the entire planet. But the VOC was way more than just a business with a monopoly. This is where it gets wild. The Dutch government gave it the powers of an actual nation-state. The company could build its own forts, it could sign treaties, and, this is the crazy part, it could wage its own wars. For all practical purposes, it was a country disguised as a company. But, when you have the power of a country combined with the profit motive of a corporation, that is a really dangerous mix. The VOC's quest for profit and total control was about to lead it down a very, very dark road, one that was paved with blood. Take the VOC's Governor General, a guy named Jan Pieter Zoon Koon. For him, just trading for spices wasn't good enough. He wanted total control. His target? The Banda Islands, at the time the only place in the entire world where the super valuable spices nutmeg and mace grew. To secure that monopoly, Koon used the company's private army to invade the islands, and what followed was nothing short of a massacre. The local population was almost completely wiped out. This wasn't a business deal, it was a brutal conquest. all to control the supply of a popular spice. The VOC model was so brutally profitable that, of course, they decided to copy it. But this time, they pointed it west, towards the Americas and Africa. And this new company would focus on a different and even more horrifying list of goods. So, in 1621, the Dutch West India Company, or WIC, was created. It was basically a sequel to the VOC, but it operated in the Atlantic, and its focus was completely different. While the VOC was all about spices and silk, the WIC's business was gold, sugar, and human beings. It was also given the power of privateering, which is basically state-sponsored piracy. The WIC's business model was a brutal triangle. They'd attack Spanish ships for silver, they'd set up sugar plantations in the Americas, and to work those plantations, they sailed to West Africa. There, they bought people who had been captured in wars, forced them into slavery, and shipped them across the Atlantic to be sold at auction. The human cost of this business was just staggering. The conditions on those ships were horrific. Enslaved men, women, and children were packed into the holds of ships with no sanitation, barely any food. Sickness spread like wildfire, and anyone who got sick or died during the trip was simply thrown overboard into the ocean. So you have these two companies, the VOC and the WIC, that were pioneers of global capitalism. They created unbelievable wealth, built entire cities, and laid the groundwork for the modern stock market. But their profits were built on monopoly, on conquest, and on human suffering on an industrial scale. Which really leaves us with one final big question. What was the true cost of building the world's first global economy?